The year was 1982, and the American farm economy was collapsing. Interest rates had climbed past 20%. Land values were dropping like stones. Tractors sat idle in fields because farmers couldn't afford fuel. Implement dealers were shuttering their doors from Iowa to Nebraska, liquidating inventory at fractions of what they'd paid. The agricultural machinery industry, which had roared through the 1970s on a wave of export-driven prosperity, was now staring into an abyss. And in the middle of this catastrophe, in a small town in northeast Iowa called Williamsburg, a 43-year-old machinist named Jon Kinzenbaw was about to do something that defied every rule of business sense. He was going to start a farm equipment company. Not just any company. He was going to build tillage tools that would directly challenge John Deere, International Harvester, and every other manufacturer that had dominated American agriculture for generations. He was going to do it without venture capital, without engineering degrees, without a marketing department or a sales force. He was going to do it in a rented building with a handful of employees and a welding torch. And somehow, impossibly, he was going to win. The story of Kane's manufacturing is not a story about corporate strategy or market disruption in the way business schools teach those concepts. It's a story about a man who understood dirt, who understood what happened when steel moved through soil at specific angles and specific speeds, who understood that the difference between a good harvest and a failed one often came down to inches of depth control and degrees of residue management, who understood that farmers didn't need another brochure promising efficiency, they needed tools that actually worked. Jon Kinzenbaw didn't set out to defeat John Deere. He set out to solve a problem that nobody else seemed interested in solving. The fact that his solution ended up reshaping the entire tillage industry was almost accidental. Almost. To understand how one man with a welder could take on an empire, you have to understand what American farming looked like in the early 1980s, and more importantly, what it had looked like just a few years before. The 1970s had been extraordinary for agriculture. Global demand for grain exploded. The Soviet Union, facing repeated crop failures, became a massive buyer of American wheat and corn. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz urged farmers to plant fence row to fence row. And they did. Land prices soared. Farmers borrowed against their appreciating land to buy more land, bigger tractors, better equipment. Manufacturers couldn't build machines fast enough. Deere and Company's profits hit record levels year after year. International Harvester expanded production capacity. Every implement dealer in the Corn Belt had a waiting list. And then it ended. The Federal Reserve, desperate to control inflation, raised interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. Export markets contracted. Crop prices fell. Land values, which had seemed invincible, began to drop. And suddenly, all those loans farmers had taken out at 8% were adjustable rate loans now, carrying interest at 18, 19, 20%. Farmers who had been wealthy on paper were now staring at bankruptcy. Between 1980 and 1985, American agriculture would lose more than 250,000 farms. Entire rural communities would effectively cease to exist. Equipment manufacturers faced a different but equally brutal reality. Farmers who couldn't make loan payments weren't buying new equipment. Dealers who had expanded during the boom were now sitting on massive unsold inventory. The used equipment market was flooded with repossessed tractors and implements selling for pennies on the dollar. Companies that had seemed invincible were suddenly vulnerable. International Harvester, one of the oldest and largest agricultural machinery manufacturers in the world, would effectively cease to exist by 1985, selling its agricultural division to Tenneco and retreating to truck manufacturing under the name Navistar. This was the environment Jon Kinzenbaw chose to enter, not during the boom years when money was easy and confidence was high, during the collapse, when starting any business was difficult and starting a farm equipment business seemed suicidal. But Kinzenbaugh had something the big manufacturers didn't have. He had credibility with farmers because he was a farmer. He had practical knowledge because he'd spent decades making and fixing things with his hands. And he had a specific insight about tillage that nobody else seemed to understand. Jon Kinzenbaw was born in 1939 in Iowa County, Iowa, heartland corn country. His father farmed, and Jon grew up doing what farm kids did, working. By the time he was in his teens, he could operate every piece of equipment on the place, fix most things that broke, and improvise solutions to problems that didn't have obvious fixes. He wasn't interested in college. He was interested in making things work. After high school, Kinzenbaugh took a job as a machinist. This wasn't farm work, but it taught him precision. He learned to work to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He learned how different metals behaved under stress. He learned to read blueprints and visualize three-dimensional objects from two-dimensional drawings. Most importantly, he learned that there was always a better way to make something, and that good enough was rarely good enough. But he never stopped farming. He bought land, he raised crops, he used equipment that other people had designed and manufactured, and he paid attention to what worked and what didn't, especially what didn't. Through the 1960s and 70s, tillage practices were changing rapidly. For generations, farmers had plowed their fields, turning the soil over completely, burying crop residue, creating a clean seedbed. But this approach had problems. It was slow. It required multiple passes over the field. It left soil exposed to erosion. It consumed enormous amounts of fuel. And as tractors got bigger and fuel got more expensive, farmers started looking for alternatives. Conservation tillage was the answer. Instead of plowing, you used tools that worked the soil without turning it over completely, leaving crop residue on the surface to prevent erosion and retain moisture. Chisel plows, field cultivators, disc rippers. These tools could prepare a field for planting with fewer passes, less fuel, and less soil disturbance. The problem was that most conservation tillage tools didn't work very well. They plugged up in heavy residue. They created uneven seed beds. They didn't penetrate consistently in variable soil conditions. Farmers wanted to adopt these practices, but the equipment available in the late 1970s was, frankly, mediocre.
Jon Kinzenbaw knew this because he was using that mediocre equipment. And unlike most farmers who would complain and then make do, Kinzenbaw started thinking about how to fix it. The specific problem that obsessed him was the chisel plow. A chisel plow is a tillage tool with multiple shanks that penetrate the soil and loosen it without turning it over. Each shank has a point or sweep at the bottom that cuts through the soil. The design was simple, but making it work consistently was not. The biggest issue was residue management. If you were working in a cornfield after harvest, you had stalks and leaves covering the ground. A chisel plow needed to cut through that residue, break up the soil underneath, and leave enough residue on the surface to prevent erosion, but not so much that it would interfere with planting in the spring. Most chisel plows either plugged up completely in heavy residue or buried too much of it. The second issue was depth control. Soil conditions vary across a field. Clay, sand, gravel, moisture content, compaction. A chisel plow working at the right depth in one part of the field might be too shallow or too deep 20 feet later. Maintaining consistent depth required constant adjustment, and most systems didn't adjust quickly or accurately enough. The third issue was structural durability. Chisel plows operated under enormous stress. Each shank was basically a lever trying to pry the earth apart. When a shank hit a rock or a root, the force transmitted back through the frame could be tremendous. Most chisel plows were either built heavy enough to handle that stress, which made them slow and expensive to pull, or built lighter and faster, which meant they broke frequently. Kinzenbaw believed you could solve all three problems with better engineering. Not more complicated engineering, better engineering. In 1981, he built his first prototype in his machine shop. It was a chisel plow, but different from anything on the market. The shanks were mounted on a unique trip system that allowed each individual shank to pivot backward when it hit an obstruction, then reset itself automatically. This protected the frame from shock loads and allowed the tool to work in rocky conditions without breaking. The shank spacing and sweep design were optimized to cut residue cleanly without plugging. And the depth control system used a simple but effective combination of wheels and springs that maintained consistent working depth across variable terrain. He pulled it through his own fields in the fall of 1981. It worked. Not perfectly, but better than anything else he'd used. He made modifications, welded new brackets, changed the angle on the shanks, adjusted the spring tension, pulled it through the field again. Better. By spring of 1982, he had something he thought was genuinely superior to what John Deere or International Harvester were selling. And he made a decision that would change his life. He was going to manufacture it. Understand that this was insane. The farm economy was in free fall. Established manufacturers with decades of experience and massive distribution networks were struggling. Jon Kinzenbaw was a machinist with no business experience, no capital, no dealer network, no brand recognition. He had a prototype that worked in his field, but that didn't mean it would work everywhere. He had no way to manufacture at scale, no way to market, no way to provide service and parts support to customers scattered across the Midwest. What he did have was a conviction that farmers needed this tool, and that if he built it right, they would buy it. He didn't call dealers, he didn't run advertisements, he simply told a few neighbors that he'd built a chisel plow that worked better than what they could buy from Deere, and if they wanted to see it, they could stop by. They stopped by. Iowa farmers in 1982 were desperate. They were facing economic catastrophe, and they needed every advantage they could get. Fuel efficiency mattered. Reducing the number of field passes mattered. Getting crops in the ground quickly in a narrow planting window mattered. Equipment that broke down and cost money to fix was a disaster they couldn't afford. So when Jon Kinzenbaw showed them a chisel plow that worked, demonstrably better than what they were currently using, and charged less than what Deere wanted for an equivalent tool, they bought it. Not in huge numbers at first, a few here, a few there, but those first customers talked. And Iowa farmers trust other Iowa farmers far more than they trust salesmen or advertisements. Word spread. By the end of 1982, Kins Manufacturing had sold enough chisel plows to justify staying in business. Barely. By the end of 1983, they'd sold enough to hire more welders and rent a bigger building. By the end of 1984, in the middle of the worst agricultural depression in 50 years, Kins Manufacturing was growing, and John Deere was starting to notice. The major manufacturers didn't take Kinzenbaw seriously at first. Why would they? Every rural town in America had some guy with a welding torch who thought he could build a better piece of agricultural equipment. Most of them built a few units, sold them to neighbors, and faded away when they realized that manufacturing and selling were harder than building a prototype in your shed. Kins looked like just another small regional operation that would be bankrupt within a year or two. But Kins didn't go bankrupt. The company kept growing, and the reason it kept growing was that Kinzenbaw was doing something the big manufacturers couldn't or wouldn't do. He was listening to farmers. When a customer had a problem with a Kins chisel plow, they didn't call a dealer service department and get put on hold. They called Jon Kinzenbaw directly, and he answered the phone. If the problem was real, he fixed it. Not in the next model year, immediately. He'd drive to the customer's farm, look at the implement, figure out what was wrong, and either fix it on the spot or take it back to the shop and rebuild it. This level of responsiveness was unheard of in the agricultural equipment industry. Deere didn't send engineers to individual farms to troubleshoot tillage tools. They had procedures, warranty policies, dealer networks. If you had a problem, you went through channels. It might take weeks or months to get resolution, if you got resolution at all. Kins's approach was the opposite. He treated every problem as an opportunity to make the product better. And because he was both the designer and the manufacturer, he could implement changes immediately. If farmers in northern Iowa were having issues with residue plugging in bean stubble, Kinzenbaw would modify the shank spacing on the next batch of units coming out of the shop. If farmers in southern Minnesota wanted more aggressive soil penetration for their heavy clay ground, he'd design a different point configuration and have it available within weeks. This iterative improvement process, driven directly from customer feedback, allowed Kins to develop products that were precisely tailored to Midwestern farming conditions. The big manufacturers designed equipment to work reasonably well in a wide range of conditions across North America. Kins designed equipment to work exceptionally well in the specific soil types, residues, and farming practices common in Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska, and surrounding states. For farmers in those states, the difference was significant. By 1985, Kins wasn't just a curiosity anymore. The company was a legitimate competitor. Farmers who visited the Williamsburg facility came away impressed. This wasn't some ramshackle operation with equipment held together by baling wire. The manufacturing process was clean, organized, professional. The quality of the welds and the fit of the components were as good as anything coming out of Moline or Fargo. And the designs were, in many cases, genuinely superior to what the established manufacturers were offering. Deere's response was predictable. They improved their own chisel plow designs, incorporating some of the features that made Kins' products successful. They dropped prices to make it harder for Kins to compete. They leaned on dealers to push Deere tillage equipment more aggressively. They emphasized their parts availability, their service network, their decades of experience. And none of it worked. Because Jon Kinzenbaw had built something that transcended product features and price points. He'd built trust. Farmers knew that when they bought a Kins chisel plow, they weren't just buying a piece of equipment. They were buying access to the guy who designed it, who would stand behind it, who understood their problems because he faced the same problems on his own farm. That trust was unassailable. Deere couldn't replicate it by improving their product. They couldn't buy it with marketing. They couldn't undermine it with price cuts. Trust once earned with farmers was absolute. And Jon Kinzenbaw was just getting started. By 1986, Kinsey Manufacturing had moved beyond being a regional success story and was becoming a national presence. The company had expanded its product line beyond chisel plows to include field cultivators and other tillage tools. Revenue was climbing year over year, despite the broader agricultural economy remaining deeply troubled. And Jon Kinzenbaw, who had never wanted to be a businessman, was now running a manufacturing operation with dozens of employees and customers scattered across the Corn Belt. He hated it. Not the manufacturing, not the design work, not even the customer interaction. Kinzenbaw loved talking to farmers about tillage. He could spend hours discussing shank angles and residue flow and soil fracturing patterns. But what he hated was the administrative burden of running a growing company. Payroll, insurance, regulatory compliance, human resources, inventory management, all the tedious, necessary work that kept a business functioning but that had nothing to do with making better farm equipment. Kinzenbaw's solution was characteristically direct. He'd keep doing what he was good at, designing and improving products, and he'd find someone else to handle the business side. In 1986, he brought in his son, Lonnie Kinzenbaw, who had a business degree and an interest in the company, though not his father's obsessive focus on engineering. The transition wasn't smooth. Jon Kinzenbaw had run the company by instinct and personal relationships. There were no formal business plans, no organizational charts, no structured decision-making processes. Lonnie, coming in with business school ideas about how companies should operate, found this chaos frustrating. Jon, who had built the entire enterprise on intuition and hands-on problem-solving, found his son's attempts to formalize and structure things irritating. But they made it work largely because they divided responsibilities clearly. Jon would focus on product development and customer relationships. Lonnie would handle operations, finance, and growth strategy. It was an arrangement that allowed the company to maintain the qualities that had made it successful innovative products, and strong customer connections while developing the organizational capability to scale. And scale was necessary, because by the late 1980s, Kinsey was facing a new challenge. The company's success with tillage equipment had attracted imitators, small regional manufacturers who saw Kinsey's growth and thought they could replicate it. Some of these competitors made decent products, some made junk. All of them created market confusion and put pressure on Kinsey's margins. Jon Kinzenbaw's response was to out-innovate them. If other companies were going to copy his designs, he'd make sure he was always several steps ahead. The pace of product development at Kinsey accelerated. New shank designs, improved depth control systems, better residue management. Each improvement was small, but cumulatively they added up to equipment that worked noticeably better than the competition. But Kinzenbaw was also thinking about diversification. Tillage equipment was seasonal. Farmers bought chisel plows and field cultivators in late summer and fall. That was it. If Kinsey wanted steady, year-round revenue, the company needed products that farmers bought at different times of the year. The obvious answer was planting equipment. Planters were, in many ways, the most critical piece of equipment on a farm. You could get away with mediocre tillage, you could get away with an older tractor, but planting had to be done right. The spacing between seeds, the depth of seed placement, the closing of the furrow, all of these factors directly affected yield. A planter that worked well could increase yields by 5, 10, even 15 bushels per acre compared to a planter that worked poorly. Over a 1,000-acre farm, that difference translated to tens of thousands of dollars in revenue. The planter market was dominated by established manufacturers. John Deere, International Harvester, White Farm Equipment, and Alice Chalmers all made planters. There were also specialized manufacturers, like Kinsey's neighbor, AGCO, that focused specifically on planting equipment. Breaking into this market would be difficult, but Jon Kinzenbaw thought he saw an opportunity. The standard planter designed in the mid-1980s was a rigid toolbar with individual row units mounted on it. Each row unit was essentially independent, with its own gauge wheels, seed meter, and closing wheels. This design worked, but it had limitations. In rough or uneven terrain, the toolbar would flex and twist, causing individual row units to plant at inconsistent depths. Seed spacing could be irregular, and making adjustments to planting depth or downforce required manually adjusting each row unit individually, which was time-consuming and often resulted in inconsistent settings across the planter. Kinzenbaw believed he could design a better system. He spent the better part of 1987 working on a planter prototype. His approach was different from the established manufacturers in several key ways. First, he focused on frame rigidity. The Kinsey planter used a heavy structural toolbar that resisted flexing and twisting even in rough field conditions. This kept all the row units in consistent alignment and allowed for more precise depth control. Second, he designed a centralized adjustment system. Instead of having to manually adjust each row unit, operators could adjust planting depth and downforce from a central point on the toolbar. This saved time and ensured that all row units were set identically. Third, he paid obsessive attention to seed metering. The accuracy of seed spacing, how precisely seeds were placed at a desired distance apart, was critical to yield. Most planters used vacuum seed meters, which worked by using air pressure to pick up individual seeds and drop them into the furrow at precise intervals. Kinzenbaw's meters were similar in principle, but different in execution. He designed the seed plates and the vacuum system to maintain more consistent pressure and more reliable seed pickup across varying speeds and field conditions. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, he designed the entire planter around ease of maintenance and adjustment. Farmers needed to be able to service their planters in the field quickly without special tools. Every component that might need regular attention was accessible. Every adjustment that needed to be made frequently was simple.
This wasn't revolutionary engineering, it was practical engineering, designed by someone who understood that equipment had to work in the real world where farmers had limited time and needed things to be straightforward.
By early 1988, Kinsey had a production planter ready for sale. It was expensive, more expensive than comparable models from Deere or White, but it worked better. Farmers who tested it reported more consistent stands, better seed spacing, fewer skips and doubles. In side-by-side comparisons, Kinsey planters consistently outperformed the competition. The major manufacturers didn't ignore this. They couldn't. Planters were too important, and the margins were too good. Deere, in particular, began working on their own improved planter designs that incorporated some of the features Kinsey had pioneered. The competition intensified. But again, Kinzenbaw had an advantage the big manufacturers didn't. He could iterate faster. When farmers reported issues or suggested improvements, those changes could be incorporated into production units within weeks. Deere's product development cycle was measured in years. By the time they brought an improved planter to market, Kinsey had already implemented 3 generations of improvements. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Kinsey planters gained market share steadily. The company didn't overtake Deere. Nobody was going to overtake Deere in the planter market, but they established themselves as a serious alternative. For farmers who wanted the absolute best planting performance and were willing to pay a premium for it, Kinsey became the default choice. And then Jon Kinzenbaw made the decision that would, more than anything else he'd done, cement Kinsey's reputation for innovation. He was going to build a row crop planter with individual row clutches. This requires some explanation. A typical planter in the late 1980s was a continuous machine. When you turned it on, all the row units started planting simultaneously. When you turned it off, they all stopped. This worked fine if you were planting a perfectly rectangular field with no obstacles, but most fields weren't perfectly rectangular. They had odd shapes, waterways, terraces, field entrances. In these situations, you often had some row units planting where you wanted them to, and other row units planting where you didn't want them to, in areas you'd already planted or in areas where you didn't want crops at all. The solution was for the operator to watch carefully and lift sections of the planter manually when they approached these areas. This required constant attention and quick reflexes, and it was easy to make mistakes. Overplanting wasted seed and money. Missing areas meant gaps in the field that would reduce yield. What farmers needed was a way to turn individual row units on and off independently, automatically, so that each row planted only where it should. This concept had been tried before, but the mechanical systems were complex, unreliable, and expensive. Nobody had made it work in a practical, affordable way. Kinzenbaw thought he could. The key was electronics. By the late 1980s, computers were becoming common in agriculture. Yield monitors, GPS guidance systems, and other precision agriculture technologies were starting to appear on farms. Kinzenbaw realized that if you could control individual row units electronically rather than mechanically, you could make the system simpler, more reliable, and much more capable. He designed a system where each row unit had an electric clutch that could be engaged or disengaged independently. An onboard computer would track the position of the planter using GPS, remember where each row had already planted, and automatically shut off individual rows when they passed over previously planted areas. The operator didn't have to do anything. The planter handled it automatically. This was, for 1991, remarkably sophisticated. GPS was still relatively new in agriculture. Integrating it with planter control systems required custom software, custom electronics, and a level of technical complexity that most farm equipment manufacturers weren't attempting. Kinzenbaw attempted it, and after multiple prototypes, countless hours of testing, and more failures than he probably wanted to remember, he made it work. The Kinsey 2000 series planter, introduced in 1992, was the first commercially successful planter with fully automated individual row control. Farmers who used it were stunned at how much easier planting became. No more constant vigilance watching row ends, no more seed waste from overplanting, no more gaps from missed areas. The planter simply took care of it. Deere didn't have anything close to this capability. Neither did Case IH, which had absorbed International Harvester's agricultural division.
White Farm Equipment had declared bankruptcy. AGCO was focused on other technologies. For a brief, glorious window, Kinze Manufacturing, a company that started a decade earlier in rented building in Williamsburg, Iowa, had the most advanced planter in the world. The impact on the company was transformative. Kinze planters were no longer just good alternative options, they were the technology leaders. Farmers who wanted the latest, best equipment bought Kinze. Ag publications wrote feature articles. Universities invited Jon Kinzenbaw to speak at conferences. The company that had been scrappy and regional was now innovative and national. Revenue growth accelerated. Kinze expanded manufacturing capacity again. Employment climbed into the hundreds. The company began exporting equipment to Canada and other international markets. And through it all, Jon Kinzenbaw remained focused on the same thing he'd always been focused on: making equipment that worked better. But success created new challenges. Larger competitors were no longer dismissive. They were actively studying Kinze products, reverse engineering design features, and developing their own competing technologies. The individual row control technology that gave Kinze such an advantage in 1992 was by the mid-1990s being matched by Deere and Case IH. The technology gap was closing. Kinzenbaw's response was to push into new territory. If the major manufacturers were going to catch up in planter technology, Kinze would move into areas where the majors weren't competing as aggressively. In 1994, Kinze introduced a grain cart. This was a significant departure from tillage and planting equipment. A grain cart is essentially a large wheeled hopper used to transport grain from combines to trucks during harvest. It's not glamorous equipment, but it's essential. And the grain cart market, while competitive, didn't have the same level of intense rivalry as planters and tillage tools. Kinze's grain cart, like everything else the company made, was designed with practical farmer needs in mind. It was built tough, with heavy-duty running gear and a robust auger system. It had excellent weight distribution to minimize soil compaction, and it had features like hydraulic brakes and adjustable hitches that made it easier and safer to operate. Farmers bought them, not because Kinze grain carts were revolutionary, they weren't, but because they were well-built, reliable, and came from a company farmers trusted. The grain cart line became a steady revenue generator and further diversified Kinze's product portfolio. By the late 1990s, Kinze Manufacturing was no longer a challenger. The company was an established player in the agricultural equipment industry. It had multiple product lines, national distribution, international sales, and a reputation for innovation that rivaled companies many times its size. Jon Kinzenbaw, who had started the company to solve a problem with a chisel plow, had built something far larger than he had ever intended. And he'd done it without compromising the principles that had guided him from the very beginning. Listen to farmers, solve real problems, build quality equipment, stand behind your products. Those principles sounded simple. They were simple, but executing them consistently, year after year in an industry dominated by massive corporations with far greater resources, required something beyond business acumen or engineering skill. It required integrity. And integrity was something Jon Kinzenbaw had in abundance.
The 21st century brought challenges to American agriculture that nobody in 1982 could have anticipated. Farms were getting larger, consolidating at an accelerating rate. The average farm size in Iowa had been around 300 acres in the early 1980s. By 2000, it was approaching 500. By 2010, approaching 700. And these weren't just numbers. They represented fundamental changes in how farming operated. Larger farms meant different equipment needs. A farmer working 300 acres could get by with a 6-row planter and could afford to spend time making adjustments and dealing with equipment quirks. A farmer working 2,000 acres needed a 16 or 24-row planter and needed everything to work flawlessly, because delays during planting season could cost tens of thousands of dollars in lost yield potential. This shift toward larger, more intensive operations favored equipment manufacturers who could provide not just good equipment, but complete systems. Farmers increasingly wanted precision agriculture technology, GPS guidance, yield monitoring, variable rate application, and automated section control, all integrated seamlessly. They wanted equipment that talked to each other, that shared data,
that could be controlled from a single interface. John Deere, more than any other manufacturer, embraced this vision. The company invested billions in developing precision agriculture systems. Their Green Star technology became an industry standard. They acquired companies that made GPS systems, sensors, and agriculture software. They positioned themselves as not just an equipment manufacturer, but a technology company that happened to make tractors and combines. This was a direct challenge to companies like Kinzenbaw had always competed on the quality and innovation of individual implements. But if farmers increasingly wanted integrated systems where everything worked together seamlessly, then being the best at making planters wasn't enough. You needed your planters to integrate with the tractor, the guidance system, the data management platform. And all of those things were increasingly controlled by John Deere. Kinze's response was to lean into precision agriculture harder. If Deere was going to own the whole system, Kinze would make sure their equipment worked with that system better than Deere's own equipment did. The company invested heavily in electronics and software development. They hired engineers who understood CAN bus protocols and precision agriculture data standards. They designed their planters and other equipment to communicate with all the major precision ag systems, not just Deere's. This was expensive and technically challenging. Agricultural equipment manufacturers had traditionally been mechanical engineering companies. Now they needed electrical engineers, software developers, and data specialists. The skill sets required to design a good chisel plow and the skill sets required to design precision agriculture software were completely different. Many companies struggled with this transition. Kinze managed it, largely because the company had always been willing to pursue technical challenges that others avoided. Jon Kinzenbaw had built a culture where innovation was expected, not exceptional. Engineers at Kinze were encouraged to experiment, to try unconventional solutions, to fail and learn and try again. This culture, established decades earlier, proved valuable as the industry shifted toward technology. By 2005, Kinze planters had some of the most sophisticated precision agriculture capabilities available. Their ProSeed system allowed farmers to map their fields, create variable rate prescriptions for seed population and fertilizer application, and control every aspect of planting with remarkable precision. Kinze didn't own the GPS system or the data platform. Those were typically provided by John Deere or Case IH or Ag Leader, but they made sure their equipment integrated flawlessly. This approach worked. Farmers appreciated being able to choose best-in-class equipment from different manufacturers and have it all work together. Kinze's market share in planters remained strong as Deere pushed their integrated systems. But the industry was consolidating. White farm equipment was long gone. Alice and Chauser had been absorbed by AGCO. International Harvester's agricultural division had become Case IH, which then merged with New Holland. The number of major equipment manufacturers was shrinking, and the survivors were getting larger and more dominant. This consolidation created opportunities for specialized manufacturers like Kinze. Farmers who were frustrated with the limited choices from major manufacturers increasingly turned to smaller companies that focused on specific types of equipment. But it also created risks. If you were a small manufacturer competing against giants, one misstep could be fatal. You couldn't afford to produce a bad product or to miss a technology transition. Kinze avoided missteps by staying close to customers. The company still operated largely the way it had in the 1980s. Listen to what farmers need, design equipment to meet those needs, test extensively, improve continuously. Jon Kinzenbaw, now in his 70s, was less involved in day-to-day operations, but still deeply engaged in product development. He'd show up at the plant, spend time in the engineering department, look at prototypes, ask questions. His presence kept the company focused on what had always made it successful. In 2008, the agricultural economy experienced another boom. Corn prices spiked due to increased ethanol demand and global crop shortages. Land values surged. Farmers flush with cash bought new equipment. Manufacturers scrambled to keep up with demand. Kinze, like everyone else in the industry, benefited enormously. Revenue hit new records. The company expanded manufacturing facilities again. Employment climbed past 500. But Jon Kinzenbaw, who had lived through the boom of the 1970s and the bust of the 1980s, wasn't celebrating. He knew how this worked. Booms ended, and when they ended, companies that had overextended themselves during the good times faced disaster. Kinsey's approach during the boom years was conservative. Yes, the company expanded capacity, but carefully. Yes, they hired more employees, but without bloating the workforce. Yes, they developed new products, but only ones that addressed genuine farmer needs, not just market trends. The discipline that had sustained the company through tough times remained in place during good times. This conservatism proved wise. By 2013, the agricultural boom was over. Corn prices fell, land values stabilized and then declined. Farmers, facing lower revenues, pulled back on equipment purchases. The industry entered another downturn. Many manufacturers laid off workers and cut production. Kinsey reduced production but avoided major layoffs. The company's financial position was strong enough to weather the downturn without drastic measures. And because Kinsey had a reputation for standing by employees during difficult times, the workforce remained loyal and skilled. By 2015, Jon Kinzenbaw was in his mid-70s and beginning to think seriously about succession. His son Lonnie had been running the business side of the company for nearly 3 decades, but neither Jon nor Lonnie had children who were positioned to take over. The question of what would happen to Kinsey Manufacturing after the Kinzenbaw family was no longer involved began to loom large. One option was to sell to a larger company. AGO or CNH Industrials or even Deere might have been interested in acquiring Kinsey for its technology and market position. But selling would mean giving up control over product development and potentially changing the company culture that had made Kinsey successful. Jon Kinzenbaw had built this company to make equipment that worked, not to maximize shareholder returns. Selling to a corporation would inevitably change that focus.
Another option was to transition ownership to employees or to bring in outside management while keeping the company independent. This was complex and uncertain, but it preserved the company's independence and values. The Kinzenbaws chose independence. In 2016, the family began a gradual transition process, bringing in professional management from outside the family while maintaining significant ownership and board involvement. Jon Kinzenbaw stepped back from daily operations, but remained involved as a consultant and advisor. The message to employees and customers was clear. Kins would remain Kins. Through this transition, the company continued developing new products. In 2017, Kins introduced a new generation of high-capacity grain carts with improved auger systems and better weight distribution. In 2018, they launched an updated planter with enhanced precision agriculture capabilities. In 2019, they redesigned their tillage equipment line with improved residue management and reduced draft requirements. Each of these products reflected the same design philosophy that Jon Kinzenbaw had established 40 years earlier. Understand the problem, design a solution that works, build it with quality, and stand behind it. The company wasn't chasing fads or trying to revolutionize farming with unproven technology. They were solving practical problems for farmers who needed equipment that worked, day after day, year after year. By 2020, Kins Manufacturing was approaching 4 decades in operation. The company employed over 600 people, generated annual revenue in excess of $200 million, and sold equipment across the United States and internationally. They were no longer a scrappy startup challenging the giants. They were an established manufacturer with a national reputation. And yet, in fundamental ways, Kins remained what it had always been, a company built by a farmer who understood dirt and steel and how the two interacted when you were trying to grow corn and soybeans in Iowa soil. The sophistication of the equipment had increased dramatically. The technology involved was orders of magnitude more complex, but the underlying principle, build equipment that solves real problems for real farmers, remained unchanged. John Deere at this point had market capitalization in the tens of billions of dollars and manufacturing facilities around the world. They made everything from lawnmowers to mining equipment. They had research facilities staffed by hundreds of engineers with advanced degrees. They had global supply chains and dealer networks on every continent. And yet,
In the specific market of high-end row crop planters, Kins Manufacturing, a company that started in a rented building in Williamsburg, Iowa, competed on essentially equal terms. Farmers evaluating planter options looked at Deere and Kins as comparable choices. Some preferred Deere for their integrated systems and dealer support. Others preferred Kins for their innovation and build quality. Both were legitimate choices. That was Jon Kinzenbaw's ultimate victory. Not that he'd defeated John Deere. You don't defeat John Deere. But that he'd built a company strong enough, innovative enough, and trusted enough that farmers considered Kins equipment alongside Deere equipment and chose Kins often enough to sustain a thriving business. The story of how a machinist with a welding torch competed against one of the largest corporations in the world and not only survived but thrived is, on one level, a story about business strategy and market dynamics. But on a deeper level, it's a story about values, about integrity, about understanding that if you solve real problems for people and treat them honestly, they'll support you, even when you're small and the competition is enormous. Those values seem old-fashioned now. In an era of disruption and scale and venture capital, the idea that you can build a successful business by simply making good products and treating customers well seems almost quaint. But it worked. For 40 years, it worked. And it worked against competition that should have crushed Kins before the company had a chance to establish itself. That's the lesson of Jon Kinzenbaw and Kins Manufacturing. Not that disruption and innovation are important, though they are. Not that understanding your market is critical, though it is. But that integrity and craftsmanship and treating people decently still matter, even in industries dominated by giants. Even in markets driven by technology and efficiency, the fundamentals still matter.
By the 2020s, American agriculture had transformed into something almost unrecognizable from the farming world Jon Kinzenbaw had entered in 1982. Tractors drove themselves using GPS guidance accurate to within 1 inch. Planters adjusted seed population in real time based on soil conditions detected by onboard sensors. Combines uploaded yield data to cloud servers where artificial intelligence algorithms analyzed it and generated recommendations for the next growing season. Drones flew over fields, identifying pest infestations and nutrient deficiencies invisible to the human eye. The average age of American farmers had climbed to nearly 60. Young people weren't entering agriculture at anywhere near the rate they were leaving it. The farms that remained were enormous. 1,000-acre operations were small, 5,000-acre operations were common, and 10,000-acre operations existed throughout the Midwest. These weren't family farms in any traditional sense. They were agricultural businesses requiring millions of dollars in capital investment and sophisticated management. Equipment manufacturers adapted to this reality. John Deere's marketing increasingly emphasized data management and integrated systems. Case IH promoted their autonomous tractor technology. AGCO focused on precision agriculture solutions. The physical equipment, the tractors, the planters, the combines, remained important, but the real competitive battleground had shifted to software and services. This created an interesting dynamic for Kinsey. The company had always competed on equipment quality and innovation. They'd successfully made the transition to precision agriculture in the 2000s, but they remained fundamentally an implement manufacturer. They didn't make tractors. They didn't have a full line of equipment. They made planters, grain carts, and tillage tools. Excellent planters, grain carts, and tillage tools, but still just those specific categories. In a world where farmers increasingly wanted complete system solutions from a single vendor, this specialization was both a strength and a weakness. The strength was focus. Kinsey could concentrate all their engineering resources on making the absolute best implements in their categories. The weakness was scope. They couldn't offer the full system solutions that John Deere or Case IH could. Kinsey's strategy was to embrace their identity as a specialist manufacturer. Their marketing emphasized that because Kinsey only made a few types of equipment, they made them better than anyone else. It was a direct challenge to the generalist manufacturers. Sure, Deere makes everything, but do they make the best planters? Farmers who valued absolute performance over system integration found this argument compelling. The company continued innovating. In 2021, Kinsey introduced an updated planter platform with features like automatic downforce adjustment that used hydraulic cylinders to adjust the pressure each row unit applied to the soil, compensating for varying soil types across the field. This allowed for more consistent seed depth and better emergence, particularly in fields with variable soil types. They also developed improved seed meter technology. The precision of seed spacing, ensuring that every seed was placed exactly where intended, had always been important, but as seed costs increased due to advances in genetics and seed treatments, waste from doubles or skips became increasingly expensive. Kinsey's VSET meter system used individual vacuum chambers for each row and electronic monitoring to detect and compensate for any irregularities in seed pickup. The result was seed spacing accuracy that exceeded 99% under field conditions. These innovations weren't revolutionary in the way that individual row control had been in 1992. They were incremental improvements on existing technology. But in the mature planter market, incremental improvements mattered. Farmers evaluating planters looked at dozens of factors: seed spacing accuracy, downforce control, residue handling, ease of adjustment, depth consistency, speed capability, maintenance requirements. Kinsey's ability to outperform competitors on most of these factors, even by small margins, justified premium pricing and sustained market share. The grain cart line also evolved. Kinsey introduced models with capacities exceeding 1,400 bushels, essentially large trucks on agricultural running gear. These massive carts were necessary for the largest farming operations where harvest efficiency demanded moving grain from combines to trucks as quickly as possible. The engineering challenges were significant. You needed a chassis strong enough to carry 35 tons of grain, running gear that could handle that weight without excessive soil compaction, and an auger system capable of unloading the cart quickly enough that combines weren't waiting. Kinsey's engineering team, drawing on decades of experience with grain handling equipment, designed carts that met these requirements while remaining reliable and maintainable. But the company also faced new competitive pressures. Direct-to-consumer agricultural equipment manufacturers started emerging. Companies that sold online and shipped equipment directly to farmers, bypassing traditional dealer networks. These manufacturers operated with lower overhead and could undercut established companies on price. They weren't making equipment as sophisticated or durable as Kinsey, but for farmers on tight budgets, cheaper often won out over better.
Kinsey's response was to double down on quality and service. They expanded their dealer network, ensuring that farmers had local support for parts and service. They offered extended warranties and training programs. They emphasized that when you bought Kinsey equipment, you weren't just buying a piece of machinery. You were buying decades of engineering expertise and a commitment to support that equipment throughout its operational life. This strategy worked, but it required constant attention. Every interaction with a customer mattered. Every warranty claim had to be handled promptly and fairly. Every product issue had to be addressed immediately. The culture that Jon Kinzenbaw had established, where customer relationships were paramount, had to be maintained even as the company grew larger and more complex. By 2023, Jon Kinzenbaw was 84 years old. He still showed up at the plant occasionally, though not with the regularity of earlier years. His health was declining, but his mind remained sharp. Engineers would sometimes consult with him on design challenges, and he'd offer insights drawn from 60 years of working with soil and steel. His influence on the company remained profound, even as direct involvement faded. The company he'd founded had survived and thrived for more than 40 decades in an industry that had seen massive consolidation and countless failures. Kinsey remained independent, family-influenced, if no longer family-owned, and committed to the principles that had guided it from the beginning. The agricultural equipment industry in 2024 was dominated by a handful of massive corporations. John Deere's annual revenue exceeded $50 billion. CNH Industrial, which owned Case IH and New Holland, was similarly enormous. AGC had revenue exceeding $15 billion. These companies operated on a global scale, with manufacturing facilities, research centers, and dealer networks on every continent. And then there was Kinsey Manufacturing, with annual revenue around $300 million and manufacturing facilities in one town in Iowa. By any rational measure, they shouldn't have been able to compete. They didn't have the scale, the resources, the global presence, or the diversification of the giants. They were a minnow swimming with sharks. But farmers kept buying Kinsey equipment, Not all farmers and not for all applications, but enough farmers buying enough equipment to sustain a thriving business. Because when those farmers evaluated planters or grain carts or tillage tools, they didn't care about corporate size or global presence. They cared about whether the equipment would work reliably in their fields, whether it would help them plant better and harvest more efficiently, whether they could get parts and service when they needed them. And on those metrics, Kinsey competed successfully against anyone. The story of Jon Kinzenbaw defeating John Deere isn't really about defeating them at all. Deere remained the dominant manufacturer of agricultural equipment in the United States and worldwide. Their market share in most categories far exceeded Kinsey's. Their brand recognition was universal. Their dealer network was unmatched. But in the specific market of high-performance planters, Kinsey established themselves as a legitimate alternative, a premium option for farmers who valued performance above all else. They'd taken a market that Deere had dominated and created space for a competitor to not just exist, but thrive. They'd proven that innovation and quality and customer relationships could overcome massive disadvantages in scale and resources. That was the victory. Not conquering John Deere, but surviving and succeeding despite John Deere's overwhelming advantages. Building a company that farmers respected and trusted and chose, even when the easier, safer choice would have been to just buy green. And that victory came down to one man's decision in 1982 to start building chisel plows in a rented building during the worst agricultural depression in 50 years. A decision that made no rational sense. A decision that everyone around him probably thought was crazy. A decision that worked because Jon Kinzenbaw understood something that business school case studies and corporate strategic plans often miss. If you make something that genuinely works better and you treat people honestly, they'll support you against giants, even when all the advantages run against you. The agricultural equipment industry will continue to evolve. Technology will become even more sophisticated. Farms will grow larger. Companies will consolidate further. But somewhere in Williamsburg, Iowa, Kinsey Manufacturing will still be building planters and grain carts and tillage tools for farmers who care about quality and performance. Still innovating, still listening to customer feedback, still operating according to principles established 40 years ago by a machinist who decided he could build a better chisel plow. That endurance is its own kind of victory. The fact that Kinsey still exists, still competes, still matters, that's the real story. Not that they defeated John Deere, that they built something strong enough to stand beside John Deere and remain standing decade after decade.
In August 2024, Jon Kinzenbaw passed away at the age of 85. He died at home in Iowa County, surrounded by family in the same rural landscape where he'd spent his entire life. The obituaries in farming publications and trade journals recounted his career, the founding of Kins Manufacturing, the innovations in tillage and planting equipment, the company's growth from a startup to a major manufacturer. They noted his induction into the Iowa Inventors Hall of Fame and his recognition by various agricultural organizations for contributions to farming technology. But those formal recognitions didn't capture what made Jon Kinzenbaw significant. What made him significant was that he'd proven something that many people doubted, that small manufacturers could still matter in an age of corporate consolidation, that innovation didn't require massive research budgets and teams of engineers with advanced degrees, that understanding your customers and solving their problems could overcome enormous disadvantages in scale and resources. The funeral was held at a church in Williamsburg. Hundreds of people attended, not because Kinzenbaw had been famous or wealthy, though he'd certainly been successful, but because he'd touched so many lives. Farmers who'd bought that first generation of Kins chisel plows in the 1880s, employees who'd worked at the plant for decades, engineers who'd learned from him, dealers who'd sold Kins equipment and built their own businesses around the brand. The agricultural equipment industry Kins competes in continues evolving rapidly. Autonomous equipment is moving from prototype to production. Artificial intelligence is being integrated into every aspect of farm management. Electric and alternative fuel systems are beginning to appear in tractors and implements. The equipment that farms will use in 2040 will likely be as different from 2024 equipment as 2024 equipment is from 1984 equipment. How Kins navigates this transition will determine whether the company remains relevant. The challenges Jon Kinzenbaw faced in 1982, competing against vastly larger companies with greater resources, remain, but they're now compounded by technology transitions that require capabilities Kins has never needed before. Software development, battery and power management systems, connectivity and data integration. These are domains where small, specialized manufacturers have no inherent advantages.
And yet, the fundamental dynamics that allowed Kinsey to succeed in the 1980s haven't disappeared. Farmers still value equipment that works reliably. They still appreciate manufacturers who listen to their needs and respond quickly. They still trust companies that stand behind their products. These things mattered in 1982, and they matter now. And there's no reason to think they won't matter in 2040. The story of Jon Kinzenbaw and Kinsey Manufacturing is ultimately a story about the endurance of certain values in a business environment that often seems hostile to those values. Integrity, craftsmanship, customer relationships, solving real problems rather than chasing market trends. These ideas seem almost quaint in an era of disruption and scale and venture capital-driven growth. But they worked. They allowed a machinist with a welder to compete against John Deere and not just survive, but build a successful company that still exists and still matters 4 decades later. They proved that size and resources aren't everything, that understanding your customer and making something genuinely better can overcome massive disadvantages. Will this continue to work? Can specialized manufacturers like Kinsey continue competing against global corporations with resources measured in tens of billions of dollars? Can values like integrity and craftsmanship sustain a business in industries increasingly driven by software and data? Nobody knows. The future of agriculture is uncertain. The future of agricultural equipment manufacturing is uncertain. The future of companies like Kinsey is uncertain. But Jon Kinzenbaw, who started building chisel plows in 1982 during the worst agricultural depression in 50 years, proved that betting against conventional wisdom can sometimes work out, that doing the thing that makes no rational sense can occasionally be exactly the right move, that trusting your own judgment and solving real problems can succeed even when every advantage runs against you. He didn't defeat John Deere. You don't defeat John Deere. But he built something that stood beside them and competed on equal terms in specific markets. He created a company that farmers respected and chose. He proved that excellence and integrity still mattered in industries dominated by giants. That's his legacy, not the specific machines he designed or the company he built, but the proof that these things remain possible, that small can compete with large, that focus can compete with scale, that values can compete with resources. The agricultural equipment industry will continue evolving. Companies will rise and fall. Technologies will change. But somewhere, someone will look at a problem that the major manufacturers aren't solving and think, I could build something better. Someone will start a company in a rented building with a handful of employees and a welding torch. Someone will compete against impossible odds and make it work through sheer excellence and determination. And when they do, they'll be following a path that Jon Kinzenbaw carved 4 decades ago in Williamsburg, Iowa, proving once again that understanding your customers and making things that genuinely work will always matter, that integrity and craftsmanship aren't old-fashioned ideas that have been superseded by modern business practices. They're timeless principles that work in any era, in any industry, against any competition. The story of the man who defeated John Deere isn't really about defeating anyone. It's about building something worth building and doing it right, about treating people honestly and solving their problems, about standing for something beyond profit and market share. Those lessons endure. They endured through 4 decades of turbulent change in American agriculture. They'll endure through whatever comes next. Because some things don't change. Some principles remain true regardless of technology or market conditions or competitive dynamics. Excellence matters. Integrity matters. Solving real problems for real people matters. Jon Kinzenbaw proved that, and that proof remains in every Kinsey planter working through Iowa soil, in every farmer who chooses quality over convenience, in every small company that looks at giants and refuses to be intimidated. That's the story. Not that he defeated John Deere, but that he showed it was possible to compete. And in an era of consolidation and scale and overwhelming advantage going to the largest players, that possibility matters more than ever.